So I am Mandeep Gosal, I'm the Director of Professional Services at ITC. I wanted to give you a very warm welcome to this special session on building trust in a hyper-connected world. We find that the two product solutions that we're going to deep dive into are verified credentials and enterprise permissions management, both of which form part of the Microsoft Entra suite of products alongside Azure AD. So I think we'd all agree that identity solutions need to evolve and keep up with the challenges of the massive expansion of diverse access points, sometimes the overlapping nature of identity and access solutions, and also the massive proliferation of permissions from both a user and a workload perspective across complex multi-cloud environments. But the good news is we believe that the Entra suite of products alongside services can meet these challenges head on. So as Mark mentioned, I'm very pleased today to share the stage with Gillian Jones from Condatis and Shelley Hill from Microsoft. I don't know if you wanted to both say a few words before we kick off. Should we dive in? We'll dive straight in. So I think a good place to start both is to give a little bit of a brief overview of what each of these products, verified credentials and enterprise permission management, actually do. So maybe, Shelley, if we start with enterprise permissions management.
Sure, yeah. Hi, everyone. So enterprise permissions management, or EPM as I'm going to refer to it because it is a mouthful, it is a cloud infrastructure entitlement management solution that provides visibility into the permissions that your identities, so that's human and non-human identities, that they have on your resources across AWS, Azure, and GCP. So it's giving you a consolidated view of the permissions that all identities have on your infrastructure resources. And it provides capabilities like remediation, so you can right-size your over-permissioned users that have, identities, sorry, I should call them, identities that have a large cloud permissions gap, which is basically when you're looking at the permissions that an identity has versus what they actually use, and that difference is what we call the cloud permissions gap, and EPM provides the capability to right-size those or remediate that cloud permissions gap and to really have a least privilege approach to managing those permissions.
Thanks, Shelley. Gillian, so from a verified credentials perspective, still part of the Entra suite, but a very different offering.
Yeah, absolutely. So verified credentials essentially is one of the newer technologies in terms of the identity portfolio from Microsoft. It is a way that we are now able to deliver decentralized identity, so brand new technologies where we become the custodians of our own identity, and therefore we can leverage it over kind of our employee life, our personal lives, and essentially it just provides a way that, as I say, no longer are we relying on organizations and institutions to run our own identity. You essentially become the custodian of it and then can use your identity in multiple different touch points. So it's really exciting to see Microsoft hugely endorse this. It is new technology, it is changing all the time, and really working with Microsoft is great. It's at the forefront of everything, so it's really interesting.
So essentially the power of the kind of the identity credentials verification is in the hands of the user who presents that credential to a claim of that identity, whether it be in an office environment or at home, etc. Just wanted to touch on one aspect you mentioned, Shelley, from an enterprise permissions management perspective. You mentioned the gap between the permissions that have been granted and what or how long they've been used for. I think it's called the permissions creep index. Can you tell us a little bit more about the permissions creep index?
Yeah, sure. So the permissions creep index is essentially, it's a score that's giving you, it's a risk score. It's telling you the risk in your environment in terms of your identities. So the subscriptions, it will actually give you this calculation that it will do, and it's a score between 1 and 100 that it's identifying the identities that have a very high risk because they are highly over-permissioned, maybe they have a large resource reach. Those are the sorts of things that it's looking at, the high-risk tasks that are available to users that they perhaps haven't used over the last 90 days. And it's making this calculation to help you identify where the problems are in terms of permissions in your environment. So it's really trying to identify where those what the identities are, whether they're human or non-human, and so you can hone in on where the fires are and what you can address first.
I think that's a concept in cyber we can all sort of get familiar with, in terms of you can't protect everything all the time. You have to pick sort of what the most high-risk vectors are, and with an identity, this measure of the performance, the permissions creep index can provide you a measure to measure against.
It's not dissimilar to Secure Score in that it's just trying to help you identify where the issues are biggest.
Thanks, Shelley. In terms of the wider Entra landscape, obviously sitting alongside Azure AD with very different offerings from the credentials and the permissions management perspective, how do these tools fit into the wider Entra landscape? And maybe, Gillian, if we start with verified credentials.
Yeah, absolutely. So I suppose verified credentials and particularly like identity, that's really your foundation. You have to prove that you are who you say you are, you can perform the tasks that you say that you can do, and I suppose that's really like your keystone, isn't it, to say that, your identity really forms everything. One of our main experiences has been helping kind of employees or people within different organizations move either between hospitals or within like a nuclear site and things. So the concept of somebody's identity and like what they can access and what they can do is paramount. But one of the experiences that we've had, and where I think we're going to see a lot of crossover between the kind of the two products, is it's all very good and well being able to get somewhere or prove who you are, but then you have to do things, right? You have to log onto a computer, you have to be able to print a prescription if you're a doctor, you have to be able to do certain tasks. So I think that's when things such as permissions management was really, really going to become even more wed to the individual's identity, meaning that, we talk about hybrid working and working from anywhere. Like you can, because you're going to be able to have all the tools that are secure, safe, immutable, all of the stuff that we come to expect now, and you can take it with you and therefore, as I say, perform your job wherever you are.
That's great. And from an EPM perspective, in light of the functionality that verified credentials brings in the wider Entra landscape, Shelley, how does that sort of work from your point of view?
So with EPM being a part of the Cloud Infrastructure Entitlement Management category, or KIM, as we can call that acronym, really, it's complementing what we can do in terms of identity governance, what we can do in terms of privilege access management, but not just that, it actually also is part of cloud native application protection. So it actually it complements cloud security posture management. So you think of Defender for Cloud. It actually has quite a few number of use cases in terms of how we can take this visibility and how we can take the remediation capabilities and actually enhance existing capabilities in terms of governance, but also security posture management.
And I think from that sort of keen perspective, something that EPM provides, which is quite powerful from a multi-cloud perspective, is being the sort of the management and visibility layer in Azure, but granting permissions for that role into AWS or GCP and so on.
Absolutely, I think it's Microsoft's becoming a security provider. So regardless of where your infrastructure resources are, you can still have that visibility, you can still do the remediation, you can do permissions on demand into AWS so that just permissions on demand, just in time provisioning essentially, to AWS and GCP, which is something to be able to have that capability across clouds and have that consistent approach is really powerful.
And maybe could you talk a little bit around the assess and advise, automated remediation, and anomalous behavior perspective from an identity and permissions point of view within EPM?
Yeah, so there's when you enable EPM in your environment, it takes 24 hours, it processes your environment, and then you have this visibility, you have this it's a nice little dashboard, of course, but then there's something called the Permissions Analytics Report, which really gives you this overview of the environment, and what you can do then is obviously take that amazing visibility, and obviously you have to go through and you'll remediate, but what you can do in terms of I suppose operationalizing is to be able to, once you've baselined, to be able to alert. You've baselined your environment. You've said, okay, I've fixed all my inactive users and my over-permissioned users, my resources, my blob containers or S3 buckets that are available externally to the internet. I've fixed all that, but now I've baselined it, and I want to know when there's unusual activity. I want to know when there's a new blob container that's that's created that is misconfigured and it is available externally. And so we can create those alerts, we can you can alert you on that, but it also alerts to the unusual behavior that users do in terms of permissions on those infrastructure resources. So it can be a good insight into what users are doing. So it's not something that you have to necessarily be actively looking at this report every day. It can actually just alert you to those issues.
It's a really powerful capability, and I think the baseline, correct me if I'm wrong, with EPM is to apply the architecture around zero trust by forward-leaning with least privilege for all permissions and providing that sort of dashboard for the user, the provider to automate against policies some of that zero trust, least privilege.
Absolutely, and it's not just least privilege for your users; it's least privilege for scheduled tasks, for keys. Previously, or quite commonly, those sorts of non-human users, they tend to be assigned a role, and they just have standing access to that role, and it might only be a scheduled task. Like maybe it runs once a week, but what it allows you to do is actually be very, very granular in terms of I know, because I have the visibility, I know that there's three permissions that this scheduled task needs, so I will give those three permissions, and I can be very granular in terms of when those permissions are elevated for the managed identity to be able to perform the task. So it's true least privilege.
I think from obviously it's a unified platform, and there's a range of capabilities across the Entra suite. With EPM and verified credentials now, if we pivot slightly to use cases, so maybe we start within Condatis and Microsoft, drinking your own champagne, where you've applied the products, and maybe talk us through a few examples, maybe starting with Gillian with Condatis.
Yeah, so I think because it's a new technology, and because there's so many different use cases, particularly for verified credentials and decentralized identity, I think it can be quite overwhelming. It kind of feels a bit like a silver bullet. Certainly we have a lot of conversations with our clients, and they're like, could it do this? Could it do that? And the answer is technically yes, but you don't want to start by eating the elephant, right? You've got to start small and figure this out. So what we decided to do was, as you say, practice what we preach. So at Condatis, we use verified credentials when onboarding new staff members. They basically share the information that we require. So this is not necessarily us sharing all of our passport details, for example. Like that is a lot of information that's extremely sensitive, but seems a bit overkill. We onboard staff that way. We also kind of, training credentials, things that are acquired through the course of our job, they all get kind of applied to our portfolio and to our credentials. And we also use it for not necessarily the most glamorous, but really functional tools like checking in and out of the building as to who's there. So if there's a fire alarm, we know exactly who's present and correct, so we can use the actual technology rather than, the good old traditional fire marshal in their high-vis with their clipboard. All of that's done digitally, which is, again, so much more secure, more reliable, and, if anything did happen, we would have a digital record of that. So we are trying to show that things such as onboarding and bringing on new staff, which obviously can be particularly complex. We also work with contractors. We have a number of people that come in and out of our building that, aren't necessarily Condatis employees. We're really trying to use the technology to service our own ecosystem and show how we can do that ourselves.
Have you been able to measure kind of benefits in terms of time to onboarding, productivity, efficiency, those sort of metrics after you've applied the solutions?
Yeah, so within Condatis, to be honest, we've not done that our own research, because I say it's more just been an operational kind of perk. It's been much, much easier. However, with some of our clients, for example, Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology, so one of our clients down in Australia, they said that it took them nearly a month to onboard students, and it took them down to 90 seconds. And they've got 90,000 students, so you can imagine the time saving in terms of human hours, in terms of the cost saving that comes with it, and even things like they're looking at now using the student credentials to replace student matriculation cards, so really making an impact on a lot of their sustainability goals. Like it really, the kind of possibilities with it are endless. It's really interesting.
A month is a long time to onboard a student.
I also was a bit like, what are you doing for a month? But hey, if you're international, you've got everything that's coming from it. It's a lot of information, and it's hard to collate. So yeah, definitely huge benefits for them.
Great stuff. And Shelley, from a Microsoft perspective, in terms, obviously we have the private preview, the beta releases. Are there any internal use cases you'd like to share in terms of application of EPM?
Well, it's interesting. CloudKnox was acquired I think just over a year ago, and so during that time, obviously, it's been brought over to Microsoft. It's now EPM, and we certainly are using it internally. It's not company wide yet. Actually, I think it's probably only on about 500 subscriptions at the moment, where we're really using it in anger, mostly to just identify those use cases, as you say, those inactive groups, those inactive identities. Perhaps common. It's really common actually to find orphaned accounts, especially when you've especially in the sort of the DevOps world. So we've been using it internally for a while now, and actually it's due to be rolled out company-wide in the next month or so.
And from I think you mentioned earlier, Defender for Cloud, and some integrations there, and reporting capabilities. So obviously, from a permissions and identity, cloud infrastructure resources perspective, and I guess by extension compliance at some point, is there kind of a roadmap entry point for integration of these solutions?
Well, I think certainly the big ticket ones are obviously that Sentinel integration, that nice friendly click that we're used to with those Sentinel integrations. That is very high on the roadmap. We don't have a published roadmap yet, but I know that's on there. The Defender for Cloud integration is actually already in progress. It's actually in place, like from Defender for Cloud. It's already influencing the recommendations and the compliance side of Defender for Cloud, and then of course there's the Azure AD integrations in terms of the identity governance capabilities, and I think again that's high on the list in terms of being able to use the access reviews as part of governance to review those risky users in entry permissions management.
So it sounds like it's a bringing together
it's bringing together. There's a lot of overlap between the different categories, and I think Kim is going to be influencing a lot of the progress that's made in bringing those categories together and converging
And I think a great value proposition from a scalability perspective with Kim is obviously with the kind of the thousands and hundreds of thousands of permissions that will be added and accumulated over time. Then you need a platform that has that unification, the governance, and the kind of decentralized identity piece that can mesh together.
Absolutely, it's having that single view, isn't it? And being able to enrich the rest of the data that we have by using the visibility that EPM is able to discover.
Excellent. You mentioned the Melbourne Institute, Gillian. Do you have any other use cases from a client perspective, sort of journeys you might want to talk us through from a VC perspective?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been really fortunate to work with the NHS in partnership with our sister company SiteKit for a long time, and obviously we all know kind of the burden that the NHS was under during the pandemic specifically, and it was all reported very well in the news about obviously specific hospitals being overrun versus different areas of the United Kingdom, and just generally staff shortages and things like that. So one of the things that Verified Credentials and we were able to deliver was a COVID-19 passport for staff. So essentially you were able to say, I am who I am a doctor that can do A, B, C and D, and then you could move around the different NHS trusts. So I'm sure there's plenty of people in this room who've done a lot of work with the NHS. Like in terms of IT complexity, it is right up there. None of the trusts have any sort of collaboration. They are individual entities. There's really kind of no single view across them. So by taking the identity and putting it in the hands of the individual, in the hands of the individual doctors and nurses, we were able to move them around, and then they could perform the jobs and go to the places where they were most required, and what will probably be one of our greatest times of need. So that was obviously a very kind of knee-jerk response to what was required during that time, and that's now being rolled out across the NHS throughout the UK. So they basically saw the impacts. Again, we're talking about kind of 2 weeks of onboarding down to a couple of minutes, which during the pandemic is obviously essential, but now why would you not do that more widely? So we're seeing that getting rolled out across as I say, the NHS. So doctors will essentially have their own staff passport going forward, and it's all going to be based on decentralized identity. It's all going to be based on the Microsoft stack with partners, and we're at the forefront of delivering it and learning loads about the technology, learning how to implement it, what not to do, what are the best on-ramps, where are the pinch points that it really makes the most impact. So it's been a really fascinating case, and as I say, there's plenty of information about it online, and really making a difference. So we've been really proud to be part of it.
It's a fascinating use case from the perspective of the pandemic and lockdowns, and the healthcare systems needing to provide specific access to specific wards to treat COVID patients, and that then being the catalyst for sort of catalysing decentralised identity by application for these verticals.
And I think, especially with decentralized identity, I mean, I work in it all day, every day, and I'm still reading things that I'm like, what? What does that mean? How does this work? Like, it's still quite a technical area that's still, this brings it to life for me. This is a real world example where you understand, okay, I as an individual can do A, B, C, and D because I am the custodian of my identity. So I think that's really where we're trying to focus, that the underlying technology, don't get me wrong, is fantastic. It's got so many benefits, but there's a lot of times you're like, where do I start and how do I do this? And I think that's where we're really seeing it kind of come to life, which is important. And we're telling Microsoft a lot about it. We work really closely, and obviously with ITC, to see how this all comes together as a kind of, a proposition going forward.
Fantastic, Gillian. And Shelley, from a sort of a client use case perspective, are there any customer EPM journeys you might want to share?
Yeah, so we don't have any published case studies yet, but I mean, I can tell you that, my experiences with working with customers so far, it's all very well me, showing you my environment and seeing that the data I have in my environment. But where it really hits home is when our customers actually enabled it for themselves, and they see their own users, and they see a particular user, and they left 6 months ago, so how are they still an owner of this subscription? And it just helps identify where perhaps those joiner mover lever processes have perhaps fallen over, and they might be anomalies. It might just be that it's a freak accident that that user was left as an owner of a subscription, but these are the kind of things that we need to know about, because this is where we're vulnerable in terms of inactive users and those over-permissioned users. But yeah, so when a customer sees their own data in EPM, it can be emotional. I've seen all sorts of emotions. But yeah, I can't really. I mean, I can talk about. There was a public case study that for Gojek. This is the sort of one that comes to mind, which was a customer actually in Malaysia, a massive, kind of like an Uber. They have all sorts of services they provide through their app, and Gojek was actually employing, I think that 3 or 4 FTEs just to look for over-permissioned users, to look at those inactive identities and groups, and basically do everything that EPM is doing. So they were so stretched for time, because that was all they were doing. These 3 or 4 FTEs was their day job. So they brought in it was CloudNox at the time, and it just reduced their workload so that they could actually concentrate on security. Yeah.
The kind of higher value tasks.
Yeah, the higher value tasks, exactly.
No, thank you for sharing. I know that there are some NDAs you can't navigate around.
Yeah. Well,
I guess
signed off. Yeah.
I guess the key question at this stage, obviously we've heard a lot about the tools, the kind of the landscape of Entra is, for customers, how do they get started, on this journey of, adopting these kind of evolved and maturing identity solutions? I guess, obviously we work together very, very closely with both Microsoft and Condatis as partners. ITC offers an assessment approach, so whether it be the control of EPM or the control of VC, we work with customers to establish the baseline identity posture, which is very much in line with our GRC approach. So identifying the cybersecurity posture, identity posture, where are the gaps against things like ISO and NIST from an identity perspective, and then creating a roadmap in conjunction with customers. And we have a number of offerings around this, around decentralized identity assessments, identity cleansers, getting from Okta or any other competitor into kind of Azure land where we see the value. How would you sort of see, you would advise customers to find paths of least resistance to adopting these tools and really realize the value as quickly as possible?
I think it's our job to help guide customers through that whole process, right? And say, okay, so where are you in identity? What's happening with identity? And not lead with a solution-led approach. So obviously I'm here to talk about verified credentials, but that might not necessarily be the immediate requirement. And it was mentioned before, identity is a journey. Cybersecurity is a journey. So it's understanding kind of where you are in that journey, what are the pinch points, and there might be an immediate, this would be a great solve for that specific area. But for me, for specifically verified credentials as a new technology, for it to be impactful and for it to reach kind of market saturation, which it's still a long time away. It's going to be really understanding what are the small increments that we can take now whilst this is being kind of universally adopted, and it's, you know, hopefully going to be going to citizens and everything over the fullness of time. So it's about understanding, okay, what are the gains that we can make now, what are the impacts that those can make, and then deciding what stages 2, 3, 4 are. And that might be kind of looking at internal identity, so looking at employees, and that's again where, you know, ITC and Condatis come together very, very closely. It might be looking at your external environments and then saying, right, okay, how does that work? And then maybe verified credentials fits in there. But, you know, it's our job to ask the right questions and then figure out what makes the most sense for the clients, and hopefully it will be some of what we're talking about today, but it also could be something else. So it's about having all the tools in your toolkit to be able to say, well, look, we can solve your problems collectively where we can, and making sure that you're getting the right solutions ultimately.
And I think particularly from a VC perspective, less maybe on the infrastructure or identity governance side, it very much depends on the client's environment, the vertical, whether they've been working in hybrid and they want to move more to in the office or somewhere in between, they're taking on more contractors, and how do you provide that solution, you know, by then presenting the credentials that you've activated for them to claims of those credentials, which is the big mindset shift from centralized to decentralized.
And I think it's also making sure that we're explaining things in the right terminology. So for example, one of the things about, you know, I spend a lot of time obviously working with multiple different verticals and multiple different clients. So, you know, I'm working with a car manufacturer right now, and they're talking about, you know, their resellers or, you know, their customers. And there's different portfolios of people that actually it can impact across multiple different parts of their business. And you almost see that kind of like, oh, okay, moment, because you can see how we can navigate that whole complex environment. So I think there's a lot of learning for us all to do, and then to make sure that it, you know, it makes sense and it is the right solution. But yeah, we're certainly on the journey, and we're doing a lot of it now, which is really exciting.
Fantastic, thank you, Gillian. And from an EPM perspective, I know we get quite familiar with proof of concepts and pilots and these sort of things, and there's a roadmap with Entra. Are there any particular sort of paths of ease of entry, if you like, landing zones for customers to interact with EPM?
Absolutely. Well, there is a free trial period actually, so it's, you know, it takes about 10 minutes to enable EPM. So, you know, once you've enabled it, as I said, it just sits there for 24 hours and processes your environment. So, you know, within 24 hours of enabling, you have all this visibility. And so it's, you know, that's an easy win. Yeah. Where it then gets complicated is then, great, have all this visibility. You know, my heart's calm. You know, I've calmed down a bit now, and I've dealt with those one or two that have really, really stood out. But then it's all about the remediation. What are you going to do going forward? And it's not just about, oh, let's, you know, like, okay, we'll go and fix all these individual problems. It's fixing the processes behind it. How did you get to this in the first place? You know, EPM shouldn't be the tool that you're constantly using just to clean up all the time. It should be used as a way of you know, re-strategizing. What's your IAM strategy, and what are those processes like? Because obviously, you know, there might be bits that are broken, and I think this is where having a partner come in and actually, you know, it's your bread and butter. It's what you do all the time. It's something that you actually have seen before, and you have these experiences. You know, it can be overwhelming, you know, in your own environment, but to be able to actually be able to have that advice and, you know, the identity maturity assessments that I know you do, that it can really just help give direction to those the identity strategy and processes.
It's a really important point. So it's that evolving landscape of threats and how you manage risk on an ever-going basis. Mark mentioned it's not a destination; it's the journey, you know, so it's just an evolving process, and you have to work with it and prioritize all the time and look at those controls and how they evolve.
Absolutely, and the cloud, you know, it's not on-prem. We can't have that traditional approach. So we need to be able to scale, and we need to be able to adapt it much more quickly than what we would naturally need to do on-prem.
Great stuff, thank you. I think we're pretty much there on time, so I think we'd like to leave a few minutes for questions, if there are any from the audience.
I'm Nick Rabesha. I actually work at ITC Secure, but I thought this question might be relevant for any of our participants here today. Looking at these capabilities, and we're talking about cloud and permissions, does it support the full end-to-end area of cloud? If we look at that being defined as infrastructure as a service, platform, and software, the reason I'm trying to target is to say containers. I think that would be a nightmare for us, especially in the security space, and accesses and privileges. Does a capability exist to go down to container level?
It does. It does look at the containers. It's the permissions to all of your infrastructure and PaaS, IaaS and PaaS resources, basically. So yes, the containers, those, like I said, blob containers, S3 buckets, those, they have permissions themselves, and and they could potentially be, left open, make public. So really, it's those permissions that EPM is actually able to look at. In terms of SaaS, however, that wouldn't fall under the KIM category. Whether it does in the future, I don't know, but really that's part of SaaS security posture management. So there's, you look at capabilities in that, like CASB kind of vendors or solutions.
Thank you, Shelley. I think we had one more question. No more?
Okay.
Answered. Do we have any more last questions before we end the session? Okay. I'd like to say thank you to Shelley and Gillian for your time and expertise. And I think we agree those evolving identity solutions are needed, based on this modern life of, working across internal, external, multi-cloud, and sometimes non-IT environments. And, we believe in Entra and our services wrapped to meet these challenges. So thank you very much. And thank you all. And I think your next session on cloud journeys with Matt will start now. Thanks, everyone.